The grand Harrison mansion stood tall and proud on the hill, its windows shining like mirrors in the morning sun, but inside, it felt hollow, beautiful, yet lifeless. Every sound seemed to echo too loudly, every step too sharp, as if even the walls had grown tired of pretending everything was perfect. The only true sound that ever broke through that heavy silence was the cry of a baby, sharp, restless, and unending. Baby Oliver, the only child of Mr. James Harrison, a well-known millionaire, was not like other babies. He didn't laugh when someone made silly faces, didn't clap when shown colorful toys, and didn't smile when spoken to in soft voices. Instead, he cried until his face turned red, kicked until his tiny legs trembled, and screamed until every person who tried to care for him gave up. Nannies came and went like the changing of the wind, each one leaving sooner than the last, some in tears, others in anger. "That child cannot be comforted," one of them had said, as she slammed the door, her suitcase in hand. Another whispered, "There's something wrong with him," before walking out for good. The mansion staff had learned to keep their distance, knowing that the nursery was a place of chaos, where toys lay broken, bottles lay spilled, and peace seemed impossible to find. Mr. Harrison, a man always dressed in perfect suits and always glued to his phone, pretended not to notice the growing emptiness in his home. He told himself his son would grow out of it. He told others he was too busy running a company to deal with a child's tantrums. But at night, when the house was quiet and the city lights glowed in the distance, guilt would creep into his chest like a cold shadow. He knew deep down that the boy's pain wasn't about toys or bottles. It was about something missing, something no money in the world could replace. His wife had passed away when Oliver was barely 6 months old, leaving a void that neither time nor wealth could fill. The boy had lost his mother before he even understood what love was, and though he couldn't speak, his tiny heart felt that emptiness every day. On a particularly gray morning, another nanny, a young woman named Claire, stood in the doorway of the nursery, tears streaming down her face as Oliver screamed in his crib. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. Mr. Harrison, who had just returned from a late-night business trip, didn't even argue. He simply nodded and watched as she hurried out. When the front door closed, the baby's cries grew louder, echoing through the hallways like a haunting melody. In the far corner of the hall, a woman paused her work. Elena, the mansion's cleaner, held a bucket in one hand and a dust cloth in the other. She was a quiet woman, the kind who never spoke unless spoken to, always moving softly, like she was afraid of disturbing the house itself. But now, as she heard the baby's desperate wails, her chest tightened with pity. She had seen this scene too many times, the nannies storming out, the baby left crying alone, and Mr. Harrison standing helplessly at the door. She had her own chores to finish, yet something inside her refused to let her walk away. Slowly, she set down her bucket and listened carefully. There was a sadness in the baby's cries, not anger, not stubbornness, but a deep, aching loneliness. She knew that kind of cry. She had heard it once before, years ago, when she had lost someone dear to her. Wiping her hands on her apron, she hesitated by the nursery door. "It isn't my place," she whispered to herself, but her feet wouldn't move away. Through the small opening in the door, she saw Oliver, his tiny face wet with tears, his little fists clenching the edge of his blanket. He looked so small, so helpless, surrounded by toys that could never comfort him. And though Elena knew she had no right to interfere, she also knew that no one else would come. In that moment, a quiet decision took root in her heart, a decision that would soon change not just the baby's life, but the entire mansion itself. For 3 long years, Elena had moved quietly through the grand Harrison mansion, her presence barely noticed. She came early each morning with her cleaning cart, polished the marble floors until they shone, dusted the endless shelves of unread books, and wiped fingerprints from glass doors that no one ever opened. The house, though filled with luxury, always felt empty, as if every polished surface reflected loneliness instead of light. Elena was used to being invisible. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her head down, and did her work with quiet grace. She had learned long ago that in wealthy homes, silence was her best armor. But that morning, something broke through that silence, a sound that stopped her mid. It was the cry of baby Oliver, sharp and desperate, echoing down the long hallway like a plea for help. She froze, her heart squeezing painfully in her chest. She had heard him cry before. Everyone had. His cries had become part of the mansion's rhythm, morning, noon, and night. But this one was different. It carried a deep sadness, the kind that pierced the soul. For a moment, she stood still, clutching her cloth tightly. "It's not my place," she whispered to herself. She was the cleaner, not the nanny, not family, not anyone important. Yet, as the cries grew louder, her feet began to move on their own. She found herself walking toward the nursery, drawn by something she couldn't explain, a soft pull in her chest, something motherly and instinctive. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was bathed in soft light from the tall windows, but the air felt heavy. Toys were scattered across the floor, a bottle lay overturned near the crib, and there in the middle of it all was Oliver, his tiny face red and wet with tears. His cries filled every corner of the room, but when the door creaked, he suddenly stopped for just a second. Elena stood frozen on the threshold, unsure if she had made a mistake. "I'm sorry," she whispered instinctively, her voice trembling, as if she were apologizing to the air. But then she saw his small eyes, wide, lost, and filled with confusion, staring back at her. Her heart melted. Without thinking, she took a slow step inside, her soft shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. "Little one," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "you're not alone." The words came out naturally, like something she had said 1,000 times before. The baby blinked, the sound of her voice catching his attention. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to hold still. Even the air stopped moving. Elena didn't reach for him. She didn't dare. She simply sank to the floor near his crib, sitting cross-legged with her hands in her lap, keeping her distance, but never breaking eye contact. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe." The baby's cries began to fade, replaced by small, shaky breaths. His little fingers gripped the edge of the blanket as he watched her closely, as if trying to understand who she was. Slowly, Elena began to hum an old lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was a child. The tune floated gently through the air, warm and familiar, wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Oliver's eyelids fluttered, and within minutes, his tiny body relaxed. His breathing evened out, and then, unbelievably, the crying stopped altogether. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy kind that haunted the mansion. It was peaceful, calm, filled with something new. Elena's eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. She hadn't planned any of this. She just couldn't stand hearing that kind of pain anymore. For the first time in years, she felt she had done something that truly mattered. What she didn't know was that she wasn't alone. In the doorway, hidden from view, stood Mr. Harrison. He had come upstairs after hearing the crying again, expecting chaos, another resignation letter, another disappointment. But instead, he found the cleaner, the woman he had barely noticed for years, sitting quietly on the floor, humming to his son. His phone slipped from his hand, forgotten. He stared, stunned, as his son's small face softened and his eyes closed peacefully. The man who believed money could fix anything suddenly realized that this moment, this quiet act of care, was something no fortune could buy. Elena kept humming, unaware of his presence, and in that soft, fragile moment, something began to change inside the walls of the Harrison mansion, something that neither of them could yet understand. From that quiet morning onward, something inside the mansion shifted, something that no one could quite explain. The once silent halls that echoed with baby cries now carried softer sounds, giggles, humming, and the soft patter of tiny hands clapping against wood. Whenever Elena passed the nursery with her cart, broom in hand, she would hear a small rustling sound followed by the softest giggle. When she peeked through the half-open door, she would find Oliver standing in his crib, his little hands reaching out through the wooden bars, his eyes lighting up the moment he saw her. Every day it was the same. He would wait for her, tiny fingers stretching toward her, as if afraid she might not return, and every day she would smile, wave gently, and whisper, "Good morning, little one." Sometimes she would pause for a moment longer, humming a familiar tune, before returning to her work. Slowly, this became their unspoken ritual, a quiet bond formed not through words, but through trust. The nannies who used to come and go had been replaced by temporary caretakers, but even they noticed that the baby only laughed when Elena was near. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the glass doors leading to the garden, she heard a sound she had never heard before, a small burst of laughter, pure and joyful. She turned quickly, and there he was, his face pressed against the crib rail, laughing at the sight of her reflection in the glass as she playfully wiped it. Her heart swelled. She hadn't meant to make him laugh, but that sound felt like sunlight in the quiet house. It wasn't long before Mr. Harrison noticed. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he was walking down the hall when he heard laughter echoing faintly from upstairs. It startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard that sound, not since before his wife's passing. Curious, he followed the sound until he reached the nursery door. There, through the small opening, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Elena was kneeling beside the crib, pretending to hide her face behind her hands, and then popping up with a playful peekaboo. Each time she did, Oliver squealed with delight, clapping his tiny hands. For a man who believed his son was broken by grief, it felt like watching a miracle. Later that evening, he called Elena into his office. She walked in nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. Unsure if she had done something wrong, Mr. Harrison sat behind his large desk, staring at her with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What did you do?" he asked finally. "My son, he laughed today. He never laughs." Elena froze, unsure how to answer. She thought carefully before speaking, her voice soft. "I didn't do much, sir," she said with a shy smile. "I just listened to him." He looked at her, puzzled. "Listened." She nodded. "Sometimes babies don't need toys or lessons. They just need someone to notice them." The simplicity of her answer left him silent. For years, he had filled the house with every expert money could buy: child psychologists, nannies with degrees, professional caregivers, but not one of them had done what this quiet woman had done with patience and kindness. The next morning, he called her again, this time with a different tone. "Elena," he said, "I'd like you to help more with Oliver, if you're willing." She blinked in surprise, her hands clasped together. "Me, sir? But I'm just not just," he interrupted gently. "You're the only one he trusts." From that day forward, her duties began to change. She still cleaned, still swept, but now she also fed Oliver his meals, read to him from picture books, and took him out into the garden in his stroller. The other staff whispered about it, some jealous, others amazed, but Elena didn't pay attention. She only cared about the small boy who reached for her every morning. When they walked in the garden, the little one's fingers curled tightly around hers, unwilling to let go, as though afraid she might vanish if he blinked. She began to hum her lullaby as they walked, and Oliver would rest his head against her shoulder, calm and content. Watching them from his office window one afternoon, Mr. Harrison felt something stirred deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the quiet realization that his home was finally alive again, not because of wealth, not because of the things he owned, but because of the gentle presence of a woman who had given his son something priceless: love without expecting anything in return, The evening light fell gently through the nursery curtains, painting the walls in shades of gold and soft pink. The mansion was unusually quiet, but this time it wasn't the heavy silence that once filled its halls. It was peaceful, warm, and full of something almost magical. Elena sat beside the crib, her voice low and soothing as she read aloud from one of Oliver's favorite picture books. The little boy, now calmer and happier than anyone had ever seen him, listened with his eyes half closed, his thumb resting against his lips, the faintest trace of a smile on his face. He had changed so much since the day she first heard his cries. The child who once screamed and kicked, now laughed, played, and reached for her hand whenever she was near. To him, Elena was no longer just a familiar face. She was comfort, safety, and love, all in one. That night, she could tell he was tired. His eyelids fluttered with every word she spoke. Gently closing the book, she leaned closer, tucking the blanket around his tiny shoulders. "There now," she whispered softly. "Time to dream, little one." As she stood to leave, a small sound made her pause, a tiny giggle, faint but full of joy. She turned, smiling, and saw Oliver looking up at her, his eyes sparkling like morning dew. Slowly, he reached out a tiny hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. She froze, surprised by the touch. It was soft and tender, the kind of gesture that said more than words ever could. Then, without warning, the little boy leaned forward and pressed a small, clumsy kiss against her forehead. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The sound of the city outside, the ticking of the clock, even Elena's breath, all seemed to fade into nothing. Her eyes filled with tears as her hands trembled slightly. It wasn't the act itself that moved her, but what it meant. This was the same child who had once refused to be held, who had screamed at every stranger, who had pushed away love because he didn't know what it was. Now, he was giving it freely, trusting her completely. She knelt beside the crib, her hand gently brushing his soft hair, and whispered through her tears, "You're safe now, little one. No one will ever let you cry alone again." Her voice cracked with emotion, and she stayed there a moment longer, just watching him drift into sleep. Unseen by her, standing quietly in the doorway, was Mr. Harrison. He had returned early from a business dinner, tired and restless, hoping to glance at his son before heading to his study. But what he saw made him freeze in place. The scene before him was something he hadn't witnessed in years, something he thought he'd lost forever. His son was smiling in his sleep, peaceful and content, his tiny hand still resting near Elena's arm. And there, beside him, sat the woman who had somehow brought light back into his home. His chest tightened, a mix of awe and guilt filling him. For so long, he had believed money could fix anything, that hiring the best, paying the most, and controlling everything would solve the emptiness that had swallowed his life after his wife's death. But no amount of wealth could buy what Elena had given freely: compassion. Watching her wipe her eyes and whisper softly to his son broke something open inside him. He remembered how his wife used to stand in that very spot, singing lullabies in a voice so soft it barely carried beyond the crib. He had almost forgotten the sound of love filling this room. Now, it was back, not loud or grand, but quiet and real. The room, once cold and colorless, felt alive again. Even the air seemed lighter, carrying warmth that spread through the hall. As he turned away, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, a man who looked both humbled and changed. For the first time in years, he felt grateful, not for his success or his wealth, but for the miracle of a simple moment, a child's kiss, a cleaner's kindness, and the unspoken healing of a broken home. That night, as he lay awake, the image of Elena and Oliver stayed with him. It wasn't just that she had soothed his son's heart, she had done something far greater. She had reminded him that love wasn't something you could hire. It was something you gave quietly, patiently, and with your whole heart. Weeks passed quietly, and with each passing day, The Harrison mansion began to change in ways no one could have imagined. The echo of footsteps that once bounced off the marble floors had been replaced with the sound of laughter, the soft giggles of baby Oliver, and the occasional chuckle from Mr. Harrison himself. The house no longer felt like a cold monument to wealth and loneliness. It was beginning to feel like a home. Every morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the dust particles that danced in the air, as if celebrating the warmth that had returned. The staff noticed the difference too. They whispered to each other in the kitchen about how the boss smiled more often now, how the baby no longer screamed endlessly, and how the cleaner, the quiet woman who had once been invisible, had somehow become the soul of the household. Mr. Harrison, who once lived by schedules and meetings, now found himself pausing to sit on the floor beside his son, awkwardly stacking blocks or making silly faces. At first it felt unnatural. He didn't know how to hold the child without worrying he'd do it wrong. But Elena was there, always patient, guiding him with gentle hands and quiet instructions. "Don't rush, sir," she'd say softly, smiling, as Oliver reached for his father's tie. "He just needs to know you're near." For years, Mr. Harrison had built empires with numbers and contracts. But now, under Elena's quiet guidance, he was learning something entirely new, the art of connection. Little by little, the distance between father and son began to fade. The boy who once clung only to Elena now started reaching for his father, laughing when he lifted him into the air or tickled his tiny feet. Sometimes, when Mr. Harrison looked at them both, Elena kneeling on the rug, Oliver clapping his hands in joy, he felt something stir in his chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. One crisp morning, while the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, Mr. Harrison went upstairs to check on them. He stopped by the nursery door and froze. The early sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in a golden glow. Elena sat in the armchair by the window, her hair slightly messy from the long morning, a storybook open in her hands. Oliver was fast asleep in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder, his little mouth open in peaceful slumber. She read aloud in a low whisper, even though the child was already asleep, her voice calm and full of tenderness. For a moment, Mr. Harrison simply watched them. There was something almost sacred about the sight, as if time itself had stopped to let him take it in. The woman who had come to clean his floors now sat there as the heart of everything that mattered to him. His throat tightened. He stepped into the room quietly, not wanting to disturb them. Elena looked up, startled at first, then smiled faintly. "He fell asleep mid-story," she whispered, glancing down at the sleeping boy. Mr. Harrison stood by the window, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Elena," he said, his words deliberate, "you've done more for this house than anyone ever could." She shook her head, embarrassed. "I've only done what needed to be done, sir." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes warm. "No," he said quietly, "you've given us back our home." The weight of his words filled the air between them. Elena looked down at the sleeping child and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her heart swelling with emotion. She didn't need to say anything. The love in her gesture spoke louder than words. From that day onward, something changed permanently. The mansion's staff began to refer to her not as the cleaner, but simply as Miss Elena. Guests who visited noticed the warmth in the house, the laughter echoing through the halls, the smell of homemade meals, the sound of piano music playing softly in the background. When Mr. Harrison came home early, the emptiness that had once haunted the walls was gone, replaced by life and laughter. For Oliver, Elena was no longer just a caretaker. She was the person who had filled the space his mother left behind, not by replacing her, but by bringing love where there had only been silence. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, Mr. Harrison would watch as Elena sat on the living room carpet with Oliver playing beside her, and every time, he thought the same thing. His fortune had built the house, but her kindness had built the home.